Welcome to Polaris Live, conversations on the US-China relationship and its global impact as seen through the eyes of experts from around the world. This user-supported channel brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association of New York. Viewers may ask questions using the bar on the right-hand side of the screen. Our guest today is Bonnie Glaser. Ms. Glaser is Managing Director of German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific Program. She is also a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute in Sydney, Australia, and a senior associate with the Pacific Forum. Bonnie is a co-author of US-Taiwan Relations, Will China's Challenge Lead to a Crisis? Welcome again back to Polaris Live, Bonnie Glaser.
Thank you, Sarwar, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on Polaris Live again.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to have you and an honor. So, Bonnie, President Biden just met with President Xi Jinping during the APEC meeting in Lima, Peru. What do you think the messages President Xi was trying to send to the Trump administration?
Well, I think it was a very interesting meeting and an important one. It's the third time that Biden has met Xi Jinping in person as president. And Xi Jinping was, we saw from the very long readout that the foreign ministry issued, not only trying to summarize the state of US-China relations, what has been achieved under the Biden administration, but also trying to send very clear messages to the Trump administration. So, for example, Xi Jinping repeated something he has said previously. He reiterated the 4 red lines. This is certainly intended for the Trump administration: Taiwan, China's path and its political system, democracy and human rights. And of course, China has its own definition of both of those.
Yes.
And China's economic development. And he said these must not be challenged. And then he referred to the 7-point common understandings that were reached between the United States and China. And this was after the meeting that the presidents had in Bali, and President Xi Jinping had proposed establishing principles for the bilateral relationship. And their officials at working level developed this 7-point understanding. And I think Xi Jinping was basically saying that he wants these understandings to be passed along to the Trump administration. And there is no specific thing that relates to Taiwan on that list, but some of them, of course, relate to Taiwan. But it's an interesting list. It's 30,000 feet, very high level, treating each other with respect, finding a way to live, to peacefully coexist, maintaining open lines of communication, preventing conflict, upholding the UN Charter, cooperating in areas of shared interest, and responsibly managing competitive aspects of the relationship. And specifically on Taiwan, I found it very interesting that Xi Jinping stressed that cross-strait peace and Taiwan independent separatist activities are as irreconcilable as water and fire, a very sort of typical Chinese China-U or expression.
Yes.
And he framed this suggestion as that the United States should see the true nature of Lai Ching-te and the DPP authorities. As far as we know, this is the first time that Xi Jinping has actually used the name of Taiwan's president. And he said if the U.S. cares about maintaining peace across the Taiwan Strait, that it will handle the Taiwan question with extra prudence. And this is certainly aimed as much at Donald Trump as it is at the remaining months of the Joe Biden administration, as the United States is about to host President Lai for a transit, the first of his presidency.
Well, that is quite a wonderful recap. I wanted to ask you, Bonnie, I know you've talked to Chinese officials and do that quite a bit. And the few conversations I've had, they generally go through a list of things and they talk about various things. And then finally, they come to a place where they really want to stress but and so they kind of circle around and then home in on the point that they really. Was there anything like that you caught on to, that yes, there was this list of a number of items, but that there was one piece? Was it Taiwan? Was it something else that he wanted to pass on above anything else?
I would say two pieces. One is certainly the message about Taiwan, because that is of fundamental importance to Xi Jinping. But the second one is related, and that is that China wants to preserve stability in the US-China relationship. And that has not always been a message from Xi Jinping, but he has taken on board the need to manage risks in the relationship. And I think it is the economic challenges that China faces at home that has in part led Xi Jinping to believe that he needs this period of stability in the US-China relationship. So, of course, that means not causing any conflict over Taiwan, and in fact, proactively restraining Lai Ching-te, Taiwan's president, which is what Xi Jinping is calling for. And in addition to that, not imposing really excessive technology restrictions on China. So he specifically mentioned that he opposes the small garden, high fence policy, which is one that is, of course, the Biden administration approach. I doubt it will be inherited by the Trump administration. They will probably seek to implement restrictions that are much broader. So the garden will get bigger and the fence will get higher.
I love the way you phrase such serious topics, Bonnie. They get us all interested. But listen, I want to continue on for a moment. This meeting that we are talking about was held in Peru. As you know, the APAC, the group was meeting there, and it was also the opportunity for Mr. Xi Jinping to launch and make functional this deep water port that China helped build. And you know, it's quite remarkable, this port, deepwater port. It runs one of these giant cranes with no people needed, and electric vehicles running back and forth, and huge, winning hearts and minds. The Financial Times headline that mega port opens up Latin American trade as U.S. looks on. Now, over 130 countries, Bonnie, have joined this so-called Belt and Road Initiative that builds infrastructure. Now, America used to lead in this winning hearts and minds and, influence building with other countries. And we now just look on, as the FT says. What happened here, Bonnie?
Well, first, let me say that I think this major port building in the Shanghai port in Peru, it really might be the last of Beijing's major infrastructure projects. First, they recognize that there have been, they've lent a lot of money over the years. They haven't been repaid. There has been some rethinking about the Belt and Road Initiative in Beijing. Xi Jinping said, I think it was in 2023, that they would move from giant projects to fine brushstrokes. And he said that there would be 1,000 smaller projects that would benefit people's livelihoods, and that this would become the new normal. So that was really a signal that he gave. And then what we've seen is that Beijing is now favoring these smaller new frontier investments in like cloud computing, 5G technology, renewable energy, artificial intelligence, and electric vehicles. So they're moving to a new phase of the BRI. I think there will be less investment going forward in these very large infrastructure projects. They also, I would say, found that in a large percentage of the projects, there were major implementation problems. So, they encountered corruption and protests and environmental degradation. There was this great study that was done by AData, a research lab, that analyzed, it was over 13,000 of the BRI projects across 165 countries,
Wow.
worth 843 billion, and they found 35% had had problems. And Beijing knows about these problems and I think wants to avoid these going forward. But as far as the United States response, I think the United States has really struggled to effectively compete with China's Belt and Road projects. There have been many different initiatives that the U.S. has taken. Part of the problem, I think, that is that the United States is focused too much on countering China and not enough on really trying to contribute what the U.S. does best. And we don't do infrastructure building abroad in developing countries as well as China does. So, of course, there have been problems with, there's high investment risks for these kind of projects in developing countries. And the United States has tried to galvanize private sector money to go into these developing countries, and they have not been very successful. And then there's other issues related to limited capacity for bankable projects in some of these potential recipient countries. And the U.S. really has very limited presence on the ground in many developing countries, in contrast to China, which has a very strong presence. And that has apparently hampered the U.S. ability to identify and to compete for project opportunities. And then, of course, we have problems with our own interagency coordination. But the latest initiative of the United States is called the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment.
Right.
I think this is the third iteration, and the U.S. is trying to coordinate more closely with the European Union on the global the global gateway, and to work with Japan. That's really an attempt here, the PGIA, to provide strategic leadership. But my understanding is that it doesn't have budget authority, it lacks an overall public strategy, and it really isn't institutionalized. So I think the US continues to struggle with this competition with China in winning, not only winning hearts and minds, but really delivering development outcomes for the developing world.
Yes, and I was just struck by one thing you mentioned, which is the issues that have arisen. And I remember talking to someone a number of years ago, whose name I forget, who mentioned that especially in Pakistan, which is the biggest Belt and Road project with about 65 billion aimed at doing, they said they'll find out that there are cultural issues where, especially where the port is being built, the Pashtuns, for a long time Baluch have felt that their needs were being neglected. Not enough money was being given to them. And sure enough, there's the terrorist type of activity now going on with Chinese getting killed and so on. But Bonnie, may I switch a little bit to this the China, Ukraine, Russia issue. China continues to help Russia in its war against Ukraine. President-elect Trump has spoken to Zelensky via telephone not long ago. President Biden has just permitted Ukraine to use long-range rockets inside Russia to try and prevent the mayhem that Russia is causing. And just this morning, if you've had a chance to catch up with it, Mr. Putin has actually come out with a whole new nuclear doctrine, as he says that going forward, if I remember the headlines correctly, if a nuclear-powered country were to help Ukraine, then Russia would consider it to be a co-belligerent. I'm just throwing out a number of data points and hoping that you'll be able to pull them together in some kind of a scenario. What's happening here, Bonnie?
Well, first I would say I haven't read about Russia's new nuclear doctrine, but definitely deserves greater study, and the implications could be rather profound. We have already seen Putin threaten use of nuclear weapons. There was a great effort by the United States and countries in Europe to get China to convey to President Putin that he should not use nuclear weapons. And at least we know that Xi Jinping did say to Chancellor Scholz, and then I believe later to Macron, possibly other leaders, that China opposes any use of nuclear weapons. Of course, he didn't mention Russia, and he also didn't mention Ukraine, but simply underscored this longstanding principle that China opposes use of nuclear weapons. So if Putin's new nuclear doctrine signals essentially a willingness to threaten once again using nuclear weapons, that could be a very serious potential escalation. And of course, it comes at a time when the President-elect Trump is trying to end the war in Ukraine. I think he's made quite clear that he wants to end this conflict. But the Biden administration has just authorized Ukraine to use rockets to strike inside Russia.
Exactly.
That has been, I think, an ongoing debate for some time. There have been people who have strongly advocated that Ukraine be allowed to initiate such strikes because the failure to do so has made it very difficult for Ukraine.
Right.
And so I think that what really changed, probably two things that affected and shaped the Biden administration's decision. One was the concern that more North Korean special forces units could be sent into Russia to fight in Ukraine. We don't know what those numbers are. I've seen them range from like 10,000 to 100,000. But I think that the U.S. seeks to deter Pyongyang from sending more troops. They want Kim Jong-un to understand clearly that this initial deployment has been a costly mistake and they don't want to see any more. And then I think the longer term, more strategic concern is that the White House really wants to put Ukraine in the best possible place ahead of potential peace talks that many people expect Trump will spearhead in the early months of his term. And so Trump having the phone call with Zelensky, of course, is, I think, a signal. He hopes to start a process that will achieve that objective. The problem, however, is Putin. He doesn't seem to be interested in ending the war, at least not yet. And at least as far as we know, Trump has not yet engaged with Putin. But I expect that will come.
Well, this is such a critical piece of geopolitics. We have, Bonnie, I don't think I mentioned to you, we have former Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel as our guest next week. And so I'm sure this is an area that we'll explore in some depth. But I want to take this moment to remind our viewers that Polaris Live is entirely viewer supported. And we'd appreciate your signing up to our mailing list at kashmeri.com and to our YouTube channel at www.polaris-live.com. There's no cost associated with it, and it really does help us. And Ms. Glaser, let me do a little bit of blue sky with you. You know, in the West, the war between Russia and Ukraine is described as a war between democracy and authoritarianism. That's the popular image that we read. Now, if that is the case, why is it the largest democracies in the world, India, Malaysia, Indonesia, South Africa, and so on, are just not supportive of the American sanctions against Russia? In fact, India has become the largest buyer of Russian oil. Just a high up 10,000-foot question, Bonnie, if you would like, please handle it.
Well, it's a very good question, Sarwar. I think the effort by the U.S., the European Union, and allies, other allies, to depict Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022 is this decisive moral question of the 21st century geopolitics. I think that's failed. It's failed to gain traction in many parts of the non-Western world. And the countries that you mention, Indonesia and India and Malaysia, they have a long history of good relations with Russia, and they have dependencies. So, for example, over the last 2 decades, Russia supplied 65% of India's weapons purchases, to the tune of more than $60 billion. And India strongly believes that by preserving good relations with Russia, they might have some influence on the development of Russia's relationship with China. I'm skeptical of that, but I think they worry because as Beijing amasses greater leverage over Russia, they fear it could use that leverage to pressure Moscow to stop providing weapons and servicing weapons sold to India.
Okay.
So New Delhi's interests don't completely align with those of the United States. And Indonesia's also benefited from its relations with Russia. I think they hope to continue to do so. New president of Indonesia, Prabowo, met with Putin just a few months ago. He clearly seeks defense technology with which he hopes to establish an independent defense industry. This is one of his agenda items. And then finally, a factor for, I think, both Indonesia and Malaysia is the strong support that the United States has for Israel. And those countries have Muslim majority publics that are strongly opposed to the war in Gaza. And so their governments are cautious in aligning with the United States. So all these 3 countries and others, I think, are sort of studiously avoiding entering into a specific camp. They don't want to be enemies with anyone.
And so do you think that going forward, as we come to a new administration and so on, that this will become, this will add some more sensitivity to U.S. geopolitics, strategy, and thinking?
Well, I don't know if we're going to see much nuance when it comes to the Trump administration or sensitivity. We know that Donald Trump has priorities, particularly relating to trade and getting other countries to do more to defend their own security. I believe that those objectives, which we saw in the first Trump administration, will persist in the second Trump administration. I think many countries will want to avoid having too much tension with the United States because they also benefit from the relationship with the US, India, Indonesia, and Malaysia, and many others.
Absolutely.
But they will not want to be too close to the United States because there will be some Trump administration policies that they will not want to be associated with.
So, Bonnie, as we run into the last segment of this, I want to ask you a question that I've been asking a number of our guests in the last month and a half or so. And this is in preparation for a very special telegram, which is our annual publication that we're doing actually mid-year, and asking a number of people if they got a chance to, in private, talk with the president of China and the president of the United States, what might they whisper in their ear to help soften, repair some of the hard points of the relationship between the 2 countries? Some specific suggestions. I know it's pushing it a bit, but I'd really be interested in, because you've thought a lot about these issues, and 2 or 3 specific suggestions to improve the relationship.
Well, I think that the U.S.-China relationship is currently in a period of structural strategic competition. They are vying for power and influence, and their interests diverge in a large number of areas. The competition, of course, is in many domains. So, we have competition in not only economic realms and military realms, but really increasingly in the technological realm and to some extent in the ideological realm. So my first point is that the relationship is not likely to improve. It is not going to return to the relationship of the past that we had, for example, in the 1990s or even early 2000s. So I think the advice that I would give would focus on the need to manage the friction and tensions in the relationship, prevent them from escalating, and ensuring that they don't escalate to a real hot war, a military conflict. And in order to do that, the United States and China need to maintain communication channels. And they need to do this at all levels. So it will be important for Donald Trump, when he is inaugurated, to maintain a regular dialogue with Xi Jinping. They should talk virtually. They might even exchange letters occasionally when necessary. And they certainly should meet in person. But top level leader engagement is not enough. The strategic channel between the United States and China, which of course has been now between the National Security Advisor on the US side, Jake Sullivan, and on the Chinese side, the top diplomat, Wang Yi, who is a member of the Politburo, that dialogue channel should continue. It's been very, very important in managing differences between the United States under the Biden administration. And then I would endorse continuing working level exchanges. They don't have to be exactly the same as those created in the Biden administration. We have working level mechanisms now in the State Department, the Commerce Department, the Treasury Department, and of course, ongoing in the Defense Department. I think the military communications are particularly important. And I also want to say, I think track 2 dialogues are important. Track 1.5 and track 2 is non-government. 1.5 would include government officials in a non-governmental dialogue. So I think there's a real need to minimize the risk of strategic misunderstanding. And the way to do that is not only to maintain these dialogue channels, but to open talks about things that China has up till now refused to talk about. So China has refused to discuss nuclear weapons, and its inventory is growing. It looks like they now have about 500. They will have about 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035, according to the Defense Department. And the Chinese don't want to talk about not only nuclear weapons, but space and cyber with the US military. There are some discussions underway about the military applications of artificial intelligence, but those are very broad and very nascent. But these are issues that must be discussed. And I know the Chinese don't like to look back at the models that existed in the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. But even though the US and the Soviet Union had an adversarial relationship, they found a way to continue to have some dialogue and to reach agreements that prevented their strategic competition from veering into conflict.
Well, that's really a succinct headline set of issues. I'm going to frame them. When you come back, I'm going to tick them off and say, all right, where are we, Bonnie? But there is a series of questions. I want to pull out one of them. This gentleman asks, how could US and China cooperate to convince President Putin to end the war right now and go back to the 2014 Minsk agreement? For Minsk agreement line for creating a united Ukrainian union, if that makes sense to you.
Well, I won't get into the details of the Minsk agreement, but I will say that I don't think that the pathway to ending the war is through China. I don't think that China has enough experience in mediating conflicts. Xi Jinping has no interest in communicating to Putin that he should do something he doesn't want to do. My view is that those two leaders get together and focus on the things they have in common, like undermining US influence around the world, or the de-dollarization agenda that they have. I don't think they talk about things they disagree with on, and I don't think that either leader tells the other leader to do something that they know in advance they really don't want to do. So I think the pathway has to be different, and I think Europe has to play a very important role. After all, this is European security that is at stake.
Yes. Well, Bonnie Glaser, we've alas run out of time. You're so very kind. Thank you very much for the timely and instructive conversation. It was a pleasure to speak to you.
Thanks for having me, Sarwar.
And thank you to our viewers from around the world. Please sign up to receive our program updates and alerts at my website, kashmeri.com. Join us again next week when our guest will be the former U.S. Secretary of Defense, Chuck Hagel. That'll be on Tuesday, the 26th of November at noon. Until then, goodbye.